Joseph is the great grandson of Abraham, the patriarch of the faith, whom God called for God's purpose to save the entire creation, whose barren wife, Sarai, is blessed with a child, and from whom God promised to build a nation. Joseph is important. And like his grandfather Isaac and his father Jacob, Joseph then is a living manifestation of the newness and possibility that God unleashed in the midst of barrenness. Remember, Abraham and Sarah thought it would not be so with them, but God made it so. So Joseph was special, possessing the gift of dreams and visions. He is the bearer of the promise given to him by his great grandfather. But the unexpected nature of life, such that it is, and through no fault of his own, Joseph's life appears to go off the rails. That gift of dreams becomes the source of tension with his older brothers, and they were jealous. They saw that their father loved Joseph better than they. And they conspired to kill him, but end up abandoning him in a pit. I don't know if that's much better. And Joseph is discovered by some Midianite traders who sell him into slavery to the Ishmaelites. See, his life has gone off the rails. And the Ishmaelites take him to Egypt and sell him to Potiphar, an official in Pharaoh's court and a captain of the guard. The boy with gifts, who is the great grandson of the patriarch Abraham, is now a slave, a minority in a distant empire, powerless, disconnected, property of a powerful leader in Egypt. This slave now, this minority, would have to navigate the wiles and whims of the empire. But we are told that God is with Joseph. Even Potiphar, the guard, could see that God was with Joseph because Potiphar himself was being blessed through him. So Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his entire household. You see, even a slave can enjoy some of the benefits of empire. But the unexpected nature of life, such that it is, and through no fault of his own, Joseph catches the eye of Potiphar's wife. She is attracted. This boy looks good. And so she asks him to sleep with her and would not take no for an answer. But Joseph, remember, is the great grandson of a man of faith. And he has his own faith. But his fate and his life are in the hands of someone whose word and whose honor count more than his. When she screamed rape, nobody cared about the fate of this low-class Hebrew slave boy. No one listens to slaves. No one's going to believe that he did not succumb to his own desire and lust for his boss's wife. Let me change that. His master's wife. It didn't matter how gifted Joseph was. It didn't matter how blessed Potiphar was through him. When the empire accused him, he had no hope. Potiphar throws him in jail without a trial, without an opportunity to plead his case. And again, we are told that God is with Joseph. God is with Joseph. Joseph got close to the chief jailer, who showed him mercy and hospitality and gave Joseph responsibility such that Joseph prospered. As a matter of fact, Joseph will prosper so much that Joseph will catch the eye of the Pharaoh. This wonderful, wonderful folk tale about a hero character just captures our imagination. And we celebrate how the promise gets fulfilled over and over again, such that God works in and through some of the worst misfortune that befalls Joseph and blesses him anyway. Look at God. But I want you to notice this. Notice this with me. Please notice this with me. We are rightfully celebrating Joseph's blessing. We rightfully see how God was indeed with Joseph. But in our celebration of what we see here, have we turned our face from the horrific power and viciousness of the empire? In our celebration, are we about to miss something that tends to get missed? Are we about to miss the ease with which weaker people are ground down by an unjust system? While we celebrate Joseph's reputation and integrity, and we celebrate that it remained intact, and we celebrate God's presence with him such that Joseph's time in prison turns out to be an opportunity to prosper, have we forgotten that Joseph was an innocent man and shouldn't have been in prison in the first place? Even as we celebrate that God was with Joseph, will we pause right now to consider that Joseph was powerless? He was a powerless, enslaved minority, falsely accused of a sexual crime and unjustly imprisoned without a trial. What difference did it make that God was with him if the system could do that to him? Oh, I'm about to get in trouble. What difference did it make that God was with? What difference did it make? They tell us that God was with. Did Joseph know in the middle of all this happening that God was with him? I don't think so. I was enslaved. Joseph, I'm enslaved. I'm about to be sent to prison. Is God with me? But you see, Joseph's story is an exception. It doesn't typically happen this way for people who are wrongfully accused and unjustly imprisoned. The injustice of Joseph's experience has become the rule of history. It happens often. The stories of powerless people being wrongly accused and imprisoned by an imperial unjust system are legion. Even in our own faith, Jesus was falsely accused and executed. Oh, you didn't say anything. I thought that would get you. Jesus was falsely accused and was executed. And before we celebrate the resurrection, maybe we need to pause for just one moment and think that the system could do what it did, falsely accuse and then execute him. In our own time, I am reminded of the story of Khalif Browder, the youngest of 7 children in New York, whose friends and teachers talked about a smart, fun guy with promise. But the unexpected nature of life such that it is, and through no fault of his own, Khalif's life appears to go off the rails. In the spring of 2010, as he and a friend were walking home from a party in the Bronx, they were arrested. A man fitting Khalif's description was accused of stealing a backpack, which ostensibly had in it a credit card, a debit card, a digital camera, an iPod Touch, and $700. Boy, who's walking around with that? The value of all of that meant that he would be charged with robbery, grand larceny, and assault, and if convicted, sentenced up to 15 years in prison. It did not matter that Khalif consented to a thorough search of his property, of himself, in which the police found nothing, and that the accuser kept changing his story about the alleged robbery, making it impossible to determine if Khalif was even in the vicinity of the crime. But Khalif insisted that he was innocent, 16 years old, and kept insisting that he was innocent, was determined to plead his case. His family could not afford the $3,000 bail, So he was taken to New York City's notorious jail on Rikers Island to await trial. The prosecutors and the court-appointed defense attorney kept pressuring Khalif to take a plea deal, say that you did it. But Khalif refused to admit to something he claims that he did not do and sought to exercise his right to a speedy trial. And here's where that system comes into play. The prosecution delayed the trial for more than 1,000 days. That's nearly 3 years, to force Khalif to make a guilty plea. And in the meantime, in the 3 years, the guards regularly attacked Khalif, beating him and forcing him into pickup fighting matches in which they could bet. The gangs that ran the jails regularly attacked Khalif to steal his possessions, and because he refused to join them, they withheld his food as punishments for various minor infractions, and he lost weight. Khalif was placed in solitary confinement. Once they calculated it, it was up to nearly 2 out of the 3 years was spent in solitary confinement. And Khalif tried to commit suicide on at least 2 occasions, all before the age of 20. And finally, when the prosecution's case fell apart because the witnesses stopped cooperating and disappeared, a judge dismissed the case. But there was no happy ending for Khalif. In the 3 years he was in prison without the benefit of trial, he missed his junior and senior years in high school, he missed his prom, he missed his high school graduation. And he told anyone who would listen to him that he could not shake what he'd been through. He could not shake it. Surveillance videos that came out later revealed to the extent in which he had been beaten. He didn't tell enough. The footage showed that he was beaten over and over again by guards and inmates. And in June of 2015, unable to adjust or recover from the horror he experienced, Khalif made a cord of his bed sheet at home, tied it to an air conditioner, pushed himself out of the back wall, hung himself to death, 22 years old. And just as I'm led to testify that God was with Joseph when Joseph was wrongfully accused and unjustly imprisoned, there is no doubt in my mind that God was with Khalif when he was wrongfully accused and unjustly imprisoned. But I hope we see that just because God is with us during those trying times does not always mean that it will work out. Just because God was with Joseph, it didn't mean it would work out. And just because God was with Khalif doesn't mean it will work out. And I know you're going to ask, but if God is with Khalif, Pastor, why didn't it work out? Why didn't God do something? And if it did not work out, in what sense can we even be confident that God was with him? I can say that God was with Khalif because I believe God suffered with Khalif. Every time the guards and inmates beat that innocent boy, God was experiencing the abuse right there with him. And every time Khalif was put in solitary confinement, God was suffering in that silence and isolation right there in the cell. When Khalif was suffering and wanted to take his own life, that was God crying out for help. And if God was in that place, here's the question: why didn't we, the people who claim God, who say God was with them, who say we love God, why didn't we do something about it? Why don't we do something about it? If we say God is there, why don't we go and save God? Oh, you didn't hear me. You didn't hear me. If God is suffering, how do we alleviate God's suffering? One scholar said, the Joseph story is all about right relationship. I said, wait a minute, that's unsatisfying. How is this a story about right relationship? But on second thought, I think they might be right. It is a story about right relationship. What happened to Khalif is a story about right relationship. Because a right relationship should make us aware of when God's own people are hurting or suffering. A right relationship with God should make us ever ready to notice that something is unjust and to step up and do something about it. What does a right relationship with God cause us to do in light of a justice system that incarcerates millions and has shown itself to be time and again unfair, violent, and racist and unaccountable? What does right relationship with God cause us to do in light of a system that results in the death of unarmed black people far too often? What does right relationship with God cause us to do when the stories of the falsely accused and even those who deserve to be in prison are treated so horribly? What does a right relationship with God cause us to do about it? I was going to spend some time with all the statistics. And there are so many of them. I can't tell you how many books have been written and studies have shown how unjust the system is, how many people are ground down in the system, how many lives that are lost, how sick many of the prisoners are, how many Khalifs there are. We have legions of stories about it. And the question for us as God's people, what does right relationship with God cause us to do in light of that injustice? The good news is that God is indeed with those who are wrongfully accused and unjustly imprisoned, and those whose behavior landed them in prison rightly. But the good news is also that God is with us, blessing us with privilege and power and with our voices and with our influence to advocate for people who are ground down in a system that is unjust. The good news is that God is with us too, to give us the power and the courage to speak truth to power and speak power truthfully. The Spirit has been given to us to take what we've gained, to use our own liberation as a witness to the liberation of others. That's the good news. Joseph's story was about how Joseph prospered in the middle of being in prison. His story doesn't end well either. For him individually, it was fine. But for generations after him, they found themselves in vicious bondage in Egypt. Khalif's story has no good ending other than more conversations about how we can make a system more just. My invitation to all of us today is to use what we've been given, the blessings that we've been given, to help those who find themselves in those systems. And the good news is we have the power to do it. Just do it. Amen.